Welcome back to Sarah History. I am glad you are here again. Today, we are going to talk about one of the most dramatic, most heart-wrenching, and most world-changing events in all of human history. A night so significant that historians literally use it as the line that separates the medieval world from the modern world. A night when a civilization that had stood for over 1,000 years finally breathed its last breath. A night when the most powerful city on earth fell to a young man who had been told since childhood that it was his destiny to conquer it. We are talking about the fall of Constantinople. May 29, 1453. Sit with me for a moment, because this story deserves to be felt, not just known. Part 1. The city at the center of the world. To understand what was lost that night, you have to first understand what Constantinople was. Not just as a city, but as an idea. It was founded in 330 AD by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. He looked at the old Greek city of Byzantium, sitting on a peninsula between the Golden Horn Inlet and the Sea of Marmara, where Europe meets Asia, and he said, "This is where the new Rome will be built." And he was right. The city was designed to be impregnable. On three sides it was surrounded by water: the Bosphorus Strait, the Sea of Marmara, and the Golden Horn. And on the single land side to the west, Constantine and his successors built what became known as the Theodosian Walls. These were not ordinary walls. They were a triple-layered system of defenses: an outer moat, an outer wall, a terrace, and then the great inner wall, rising 15 meters high with towers every 50 meters, stretching nearly 6 kilometers from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. For over 1,000 years, those walls had never been breached from the outside. Armies came: Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, Vikings. Crusaders almost broke through in 1204, but they came from the sea, from the undefended Golden Horn side. The land walls, never conquered. Never. Inside those walls was a city unlike any other in the world at that time. At its height in the 5th and 6th centuries, Constantinople had a population of over 500,000 people. That was roughly 10 times the size of London at the same period. The city had paved streets, running water through aqueducts, a sewer system, public hospitals, libraries filled with texts from ancient Greece and Rome, texts that had been lost everywhere else on earth. The Hagia Sophia, built in 537 AD under Emperor Justinian, was the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years. When people entered it for the first time, they reportedly wept. Not from sadness, but from sheer, overwhelming beauty. The dome seemed to float, suspended from heaven by a golden chain of light. This was the Eastern Roman Empire, which we today call the Byzantine Empire. While Western Rome collapsed in 476 AD, the eastern half kept going. It preserved Roman law, Roman administration, Greek learning, Christian theology. It was the bridge across which the ancient world passed into the future. Every book of Plato and Aristotle that survived into the Renaissance survived because Constantinople kept it. But empires breathe in cycles, and by the 15th century, Constantinople was barely breathing at all. Part 2. The Empire at the Edge of Extinction. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire was a ghost of itself. The Black Death had decimated its population. Internal civil wars had drained its treasury. A series of weak emperors had made terrible political decisions. Crusading armies from the west had ransacked the city in 1204 and ruled it for 50 years, stripping wealth and breaking morale. The empire that had once spanned from Spain to Mesopotamia now controlled barely more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered islands. The population of the city had fallen from 500,000 to perhaps 50 or 60,000 people. Entire neighborhoods were empty. Farms grew inside the city walls. The great hippodrome, where chariot races had once drawn 100,000 spectators, was silent and crumbling. The emperor in 1453 was Constantine XI Palaiologos. He was 51 years old, a decent man, a capable soldier, and a tragic figure in every sense. He knew what was coming. He had written letters to every Christian ruler in Europe, the Pope, the King of France, the King of Hungary, the Doge of Venice, begging for soldiers, ships, money, anything. The responses were either silence or vague promises that never materialized. The Christian West had too many problems of its own. Too much politics. Too much theological dispute. They argued over whether the Catholic and Orthodox churches should reunite even as the wolves gathered at the gate. In the end, when the final siege began, Constantine had approximately 7,000 to 8,000 men to defend over 20 kilometers of walls. That is fewer than 400 soldiers per kilometer of wall. And coming toward him was an army of at least 80,000 men, possibly more. Some accounts say 100,000. And they were led by a man who was only 21 years old. Part 3. The Sultan who was born for this. His name was Mehmed II. He would come to be called Mehmed the Conqueror, Fatih Sultan Mehmed in Turkish. And in 1453, he was a young man with an obsession that bordered on divine madness. From the time he could understand words, Mehmed had been told about Constantinople. There was a hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, that said a great commander would one day conquer the city and that commander and his army would be blessed. Every Ottoman sultan before Mehmed had tried to take Constantinople and failed. His great-grandfather Bayezid had blockaded it for years. His father Murad had besieged it. All had failed against those walls. Mehmed grew up studying the city. He learned Greek so he could read accounts of its defenses in the original language. He studied military engineering. He collected maps. He corresponded with experts. And the moment he became sultan in 1451, after his father died, he began making his plans. He first built a fortress called Rum-i-Hizari on the European shore of the Bosphorus Strait, directly across from an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian shore. This stranglehold cut off Constantinople's supply lines from the Black Sea. The city was being slowly encircled even before the official siege began. The Byzantines protested. Mehmed ignored them. When Byzantine farmers near the construction site objected, he had them killed. He was sending a message. The time for messages between equals was over. Then he went looking for a man named Urban. Urban was a Hungarian engineer, a cannon maker, possibly one of the greatest in the world at that time. He had first approached Constantine XI, offering his services to the Byzantines. Constantine wanted to hire him, but the Byzantine treasury was empty. He could not afford Urban's fee. Urban then went to Mehmed, who not only paid him handsomely but gave him all the resources, all the metal, all the workers, all the time he needed. What Urban built for Mehmed changed warfare forever. He built the largest cannon the world had ever seen. Contemporary sources called it a bombard. It was approximately 8 meters long. It fired stone cannonballs that weighed somewhere between 500 and 600 kilograms. When it was test-fired near Mehmed's palace, the sound was heard from 15 kilometers away. Women in the city fainted from the noise alone. The cannonball buried itself nearly 2 meters into the ground. Mehmed had several of these massive guns made, along with dozens of smaller but still enormous cannons. He was not going to siege Constantinople in the old way. He was going to blow holes in the legend. Part 4. The walls begin to speak. The Ottoman army arrived outside Constantinople on April 2, 1453. They stretched across the entire land front. Mehmed's personal red and gold tent was pitched in the center. On April 6, the bombardment began. And the walls held. Not because the cannons were ineffective. They were devastating. Every day the great bombard and its companions would open cracks and crumble sections of the outer and inner walls. But Urban's largest cannon could only fire 7 times per day. The barrel had to cool between shots, and the reloading process was immense. And every night, the Byzantine defenders would rush into the breaches with wooden beams, barrels filled with earth, rubble, anything they could carry, and patch the holes before dawn. It was exhausting, agonizing, heroic work. Night after night after night. The Byzantine defenders were commanded partly by Constantine himself and partly by a remarkable Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. Genoa, unlike Venice, had sent a small force to help defend the city, about 700 soldiers. Not because they were noble, but because they had trade interests there. But Giustiniani was a gifted commander and Constantine gave him command of the most critical section of the walls. Inside the city, the mood was a mixture of determination, despair, and spiritual fervency. Religious processions moved through the streets. Icons were carried around the walls. Priests prayed over soldiers. The Hagia Sophia was full every night with people who did not know if they would be alive the next morning. Constantine sent ships out to look for the promised Venetian fleet. They found nothing. Empty seas. The West was not coming. Meanwhile, Mehmed was growing frustrated. The weeks were passing. His generals were whispering. Some were suggesting he abandon the siege, that the walls were simply too strong. And then came one of the most extraordinary moments of the entire campaign. The Golden Horn, the inlet that protected the city's northern walls and its harbor, was blocked by a massive chain the Byzantines had stretched across its mouth. No Ottoman ship could enter the Golden Horn. And without controlling the water, Mehmed could not attack from the north. So Mehmed did something that still seems barely believable today. He built a road. Over the hill behind his camp, he constructed a greased wooden trackway. Some accounts say they used animal fat and logs, and in a single night, he had 70 to 80 ships dragged out of the Bosphorus, over the hill, and relaunched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. When the Byzantines woke up the next morning and looked out from their northern walls, they saw an Ottoman fleet already inside the Golden Horn. It was a moment of pure psychological devastation. The impossible had happened. Part 5. The Final Days. By mid-May, after 6 weeks of constant bombardment and assault, the defenders were exhausted beyond description. Many were sleeping in their armor at the walls because there was no time to take it off. The constant thunder of cannons had become the only music of their lives. Food was running low. Men were dying every day. Constantine still hoped. On May 23rd, a Venetian ship that had gone out searching for the promised fleet returned. Its captain told Constantine what he had found. Nothing. No fleet was coming. No army. No rescue. Constantine wept. Then he wiped his eyes and went back to the walls. By May 28th, both sides knew the end was close. The walls on the western land front had been battered into something barely resembling walls anymore. The outer defenses were largely gone. The inner wall had enormous gaps. Giustiniani's men were holding together with sheer willpower. That evening, May 28th, Constantine called his commanders and his nobles together. What he said to them has been recorded in slightly different versions by different chroniclers, but the essence is the same. He thanked them. He told them they were defending not just a city but the faith, the civilization, the memory of everything that Rome had ever meant. He told them he would die with them if God willed it. He asked their forgiveness for any wrong he had ever done. Grown men wept openly. Then Constantine walked to the Hagia Sophia. Inside, the cathedral was packed with every person who could fit, Orthodox and Catholic Christians standing together, their theological arguments forgotten in the face of what was coming. They sang. They prayed. Constantine took communion. He said his personal prayers alone, quietly, before the altar. Then he left, mounted his horse, and rode to the walls. Mehmed that same night was also making his final preparations. He walked through his camp speaking to his soldiers. He reminded them of the hadith. He promised them the traditional 3 days of plunder that Islamic law of the time permitted after a city taken by force. He told them this was the night they would enter history. At around 1:30 in the morning on May 29, 1453, Mehmed ordered the assault to begin. Part 6. The Last Night. The first waves sent against the walls were irregular troops, men from various subject peoples, Anatolian irregulars, Slavic forces. They were deliberately expendable. Mehmed sent them first to wear down the defenders and absorb the initial fire. They came in wave after wave, screaming, carrying ladders, being cut down and replaced. The noise was beyond anything the defenders had ever experienced. Thousands of drummers and trumpeters on the Ottoman side played continuously to mask communications and to sustain psychological terror. After the irregulars came the Anatolian regulars, better trained, better equipped. They pushed harder. They nearly broke through at several points. The defenders held. Then Mehmed committed his finest soldiers. The Janissaries. The elite infantry of the Ottoman army, men raised from childhood to be warriors, trained their entire lives for this single type of warfare. Disciplined. Silent in comparison to the chaos before them. Professional. And fate, or misfortune, intervened. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese commander who had been the spine of the defense, was struck by a bullet or crossbow bolt, accounts differ, that pierced through a gap in his armor. The wound was serious, possibly fatal. He asked Constantine for permission to leave the walls to have it treated. Constantine begged him to stay. Giustiniani insisted. He was carried away from the walls. When the soldiers who had followed him saw their commander being carried back from the walls, some broke. They pulled back. In the confusion, a small gate in the walls, a postern gate called the Kirkaporta, was found to be unlocked or had been left open accidentally during the fighting. A group of Ottoman soldiers found it and poured through. Suddenly, there were Ottoman soldiers inside the walls. Constantine saw what was happening. He reportedly threw off the imperial insignia, the purple cloak that marked him as emperor, so that he would not be captured and used as a bargaining piece. He drew his sword. He rode into the mass of fighting men near the breach. And that is where history loses him. Constantine XI, the last emperor of Rome, the last ruler of a civilization that had existed since 27 BC, died fighting somewhere in that chaos. His body was never definitively identified. Some Ottomans later produced a head and claimed it was his. But no one could be certain. He simply disappeared into the battle, the way a wave disappears into the sea. The city fell before dawn. Part 7. What was lost, what was gained? When the sun rose on May 29, 1453, Mehmed II rode into Constantinople. He made his way to the Hagia Sophia, where thousands of civilians had taken shelter, believing the ancient legend that said an angel would descend and defend the church if enemies entered it. The angel did not descend. Mehmed stood inside the great cathedral and reportedly stopped a soldier from chipping at the marble floor. He declared the building a mosque. He knelt and prayed. By all accounts, Mehmed was genuinely moved by the Hagia Sophia. He reportedly murmured a Persian verse: "The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars, the owl calls the watches in the towers of Afrasiab." The emperors and their empire turned to dust. The 3 days of permitted plunder were real and brutal. Thousands of civilians were enslaved. Monasteries were looted. Books were burned. Art was destroyed. It was the violence that attends the death of civilizations, and it was devastating. But here is what history also records. After 3 days, Mehmed ended the plunder. He began the process of repopulating the devastated city, which he made his new capital. He brought in Turkish, Greek, Armenian, and Jewish settlers. He restored the Greek Patriarchate and guaranteed the rights of Orthodox Christians to practice their religion. He himself was a man of genuine intellectual curiosity. He had himself painted by the Venetian artist Gentile Bellini. He collected manuscripts. He appointed scholars. He was, by the standards of his age, a complex and surprisingly enlightened conqueror. Constantinople became Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire, which would last until 1922. And in many ways, the city flourished again under Ottoman rule. The population grew. Trade resumed. The Hagia Sophia stood, as it has stood to this day. But something irreplaceable was also gone. As the Byzantine scholars fled westward in the months and years before and after the fall, they carried manuscripts with them. Greek texts, mathematical and philosophical and literary works that had been preserved in Constantinople for 1,000 years while Europe forgot them. They brought these texts to Italy, to Florence, to Venice, to Rome. And historians widely credit this influx of Greek classical learning, arriving in Italy just as the printing press was being developed, just as wealthy Italian patrons were funding the arts, as one of the key sparks that ignited the Renaissance. The greatest creative and intellectual explosion in European history was partly fueled by the ashes of Constantinople. The fall also shook European trade. Constantinople had controlled the primary land routes between Europe and Asia. With it now in Ottoman hands, the trade routes were disrupted and taxed heavily. European powers began funding exploration of alternative routes. Within 4 decades, Columbus had crossed the Atlantic and Vasco da Gama had sailed around Africa to India. The age of exploration, which reshaped the entire globe, was at least partly born from the economic shock of 1453. One empire ended, and the ripples changed the entire world. Part 8. The human weight of it. I want to stay here for a moment, because history is not just dates and battles. History is people. Think about what it felt like to be a person in Constantinople on May 28, 1453. You had grown up in a city that had stood for over 1,000 years. Your parents had grown up there. Your grandparents. Going back for 40 or 50 generations, your family had lived inside those walls. The walls that had never broken. The walls that had turned back every enemy. And now you stood on the wall, or you knelt in the Hagia Sophia, or you hid in a basement with your children, and you knew, not feared, knew, that tomorrow the world you had always known would end. There is a scholar and historian named Stephen Runciman who wrote one of the definitive accounts of the fall of Constantinople. He ended his book with a line that I think is one of the most powerful sentences in all of historical writing. He wrote that the fall of Constantinople was a great and terrible thing. It was the end of a civilization and the beginning of another. But for those who lived through it, it was simply the end of the world. Think about Justiniani, carried off the walls wounded, knowing as he was taken away that the city would fall and that in some sense his leaving had helped make it so. He died on the island of Chios a few days later, from his wound. He never knew if he could have changed the outcome had he stayed. That uncertainty would be a terrible thing to carry, even for a few days. Think about Constantine, taking communion in the great cathedral he knew would be a mosque before the next sundown. Writing to the walls. Throwing away the purple. Choosing to die fighting rather than live as a prisoner or an exile. There is something almost unbearably Roman about that choice. He was the last emperor of a civilization that had stretched back 1,500 years, and he chose to end it the way it had been lived, standing, fighting, refusing to surrender. There is a particular kind of human courage that is not about victory. It is not heroism in the triumphant sense. It is the courage of people who know they are going to lose and who choose, anyway, to keep faith with everything they love. Constantine had that courage. Justiniani had it. The soldiers who patched the walls every night for 53 nights had it. The priests who carried icons through the streets had it. The families who stayed and prayed in the Hagia Sophia when they could have fled had it. That kind of courage does not change the outcome. But it says something permanent about the nature of human beings. That we can stand in the face of the inevitable and still choose to be ourselves completely, to the last moment. Part 9. Why this story still matters. You might wonder why, in 2025, we should spend our time thinking about something that happened in 1453. And the answer is that everything about the world we live in today carries the fingerprints of that night. The political map of the Middle East, the Balkans, North Africa, and Central Asia was shaped for centuries by the Ottoman Empire that was built partly on the foundation of what was taken in 1453. The Greek national identity, which fueled a revolution in the 1820s and created a modern nation, was formed in part by the memory of what was lost. The word Byzantine in English, meaning something complex, labyrinthine, devious, reflects the prejudice of Western Europeans who never fully respected the empire while it lived and felt guilty about abandoning it when it died. The Renaissance, which gave us Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and the philosophical and scientific revolutions that led directly to the modern world, was fertilized by the Greek scholars and their manuscripts who fled Constantinople. When you read Shakespeare, you are reading a man who was influenced by Italian writers, who were influenced by Greek texts, that survived because Constantinople preserved them. The Ottoman Empire that rose from 1453 shaped what are now the nations of Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Albania, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and more. All of these modern identities, all of these modern conflicts, carry within them the long echo of the world that Mehmed II built after he rode into Constantinople that May morning. And on a simpler, more human level, this story matters because it is one of the great human stories. Of a young man burning with destiny and vision, remaking the world with terrifying effectiveness. Of an old civilization, worn down and abandoned by its friends, finding in its final hours a kind of dignity and courage that its centuries of greatness had not always managed. Of the way endings create beginnings. Of the way the things we lose sometimes scatter like seeds that bloom elsewhere, in forms we never expected. Closing. The Hagia Sophia still stands in Istanbul today. For nearly 500 years it was a mosque. Then in 1934, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk converted it into a museum as a gesture of secular modernity. In 2020, it was reconverted to a mosque by the Turkish government. It has been a cathedral, a mosque, a museum, and a mosque again. It has been standing for almost 1,500 years, and it has seen every kind of human moment you can imagine. If you stand inside it today and look up at that dome that the Byzantine architect Procopius said appeared to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain, you are looking at something that Constantine the Great prayed under, that Justinian built, that the last Byzantine emperor wept in, that Mehmed II knelt in, that millions of ordinary human beings over 15 centuries have looked up at and felt something they could not quite name. That feeling, whatever it is, that is what history does to us. It reminds us that we are small and that we are part of something enormous. That the things we build can outlast us by centuries. That the things we lose can turn into something we never expected. That the young man with an obsession and the old emperor with a sword are both carrying something larger than themselves toward a destination that neither one fully controls. On the night of May 28, 1453, Constantine XI knelt before the altar of the Hagia Sophia for the last time. He prayed. He took the bread and the wine. He stood up, walked out through those great bronze doors, mounted his horse, and rode toward the walls. He knew what was waiting. He went anyway. That is what it means to be human. That is why we tell these stories. This has been Sarah History, Episode 3. Thank you for being here with me. I will see you in the next one.